I used to believe that family meant unconditional support, that the people who raised you would always have your back. I thought that when my parents promised me a college education, when they opened that dedicated account in my name and showed me the statements every year, that my future was secure. After all, the Wilsons had built their reputation in our small town on being responsible, church-going people who always did right by family. How ironic that turned out to be. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. For 18 years, Tyler Wilson had been the good kid. I'd maintained a 4.0 GPA through high school. I'd captained the debate team to nationals. I'd volunteer at the local animal shelter every weekend instead of partying like my classmates. I'd even turned down a chance to travel through Europe the summer before senior year because my mom said the money should go toward my education instead. Your future comes first, my father would declare at every family gathering, raising his glass while my aunts and uncles nodded in approval. My mother would squeeze my shoulder when this happened, a silent promise I mistook for certainty. When I earned that full-ride scholarship to my safety school, they encouraged me to aim higher. Take the leap, they said. Apply to those Ivy League colleges. We've got your tuition covered. So I did. I worked myself to exhaustion writing those application essays, acing the interviews, and finally, getting that acceptance letter from Cornell. The acceptance that now sits in my drawer, useless as the promises that came with it. My name is Tyler Wilson, and this is the story of how my family betrayed my trust, stole my future, and then had the audacity to ask for my help when everything fell apart. Growing up in Mapleton, Pennsylvania, population 8,742 meant everyone knew everyone else's business. The Wilsons were fixtures in the community. My father, David, ran the most successful real estate agency in 3 counties. My mother, Elaine, was the longtime head of the PTA and organized the town's annual charity gala. My younger sister, Haley, was following in my academic footsteps, just 2 years behind me in school. We lived in a spacious colonial-style house on Oak Ridge Drive, the kind with a perfectly manicured lawn and a 2-car garage. From the outside, we were the quintessential American success story, hard-working parents raising bright, ambitious children, the kind of family other parents pointed to when lecturing their own kids. You should be more like the Wilson boy, they'd say. He's going places, and I was going places. That was the plan anyway. My parents started my college fund the day I was born. Every birthday, every Christmas, relatives would contribute. For Tyler's future, they'd write on cards, containing checks that went straight into the account. By the time I turned 16, I was allowed to see the statements. The balance had grown to over $120,000. By the time you graduate, it should be enough for 4 years at a good school, my father explained, showing me the projected growth charts he'd created. If you get scholarships too, even better. You could do a master's program, maybe even look at law school. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? These were the same parents who'd never missed a school event, who'd built my science fair projects with me, who'd taught me that honesty and hard work were the foundations of a good life. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in Harrisburg, my cousin Amber was living a very different life. Aunt Melissa, my mother's sister, had always been the family's black sheep. She'd gotten pregnant with Amber at 19, married Amber's father on a whim, and divorced him 3 years later. She bounced between jobs, apartments, and boyfriends while Amber grew increasingly wild and rebellious. Family gatherings were always tense when they attended. Aunt Melissa would drink too much wine and make passive-aggressive comments about how some people had all the luck. Amber would sulk in corners or disappear to smoke cigarettes behind the garage. As teenagers, we were expected to hang out together, but we had nothing in common. While I was preparing for debate tournaments, Amber was sneaking out to parties. While I was applying to summer internships, Amber was getting suspended for having pills in her locker. It's not her fault, my mother would say whenever I complained about being forced to include Amber. She hasn't had your advantages. We need to show her there's another way to live. I tried. I really did. When Amber needed help with homework, I tutored her. When she needed a ride because she'd missed the bus again, I drove out of my way to pick her up. When she called me at 2 a.m., drunk at some party and afraid to call her mother, I snuck out and brought her to our house, where she slept it off in our basement. By the time we were 17, Amber had been to juvenile detention twice, once for shoplifting, once for possession. My parents shook their heads, but never gave up on her. Family doesn't abandon family, my father would say. Your aunt and cousin need our support, not our judgment. I admired that about them, their unwavering commitment to family, their willingness to offer second chances. It made me proud to be a Wilson. Little did I know that this same family loyalty would eventually be weaponized against me. Senior year arrived with the flurry of college applications, scholarship essays, and campus visits. My guidance counselor urged me to apply to Ivy League schools. With your grades, extracurriculars, and test scores, you've got a real shot, she told me. Don't sell yourself short by only applying to state schools. I brought the idea home to my parents, expecting them to be concerned about the cost. Cornell, Harvard, Yale. These weren't just academically challenging to get into, they came with price tags that could exceed $70,000 per year. To my surprise, they were enthusiastic. This is exactly what we've been saving for, my father said. You've worked hard, Tyler. You deserve to aim high. My mother nodded, her eyes bright with pride. The college fund is healthy. With scholarships and financial aid, we can make it work. Even if you don't get much aid, we've planned for this. So, I applied. I spent weeks perfecting my personal statements, gathering recommendations, and preparing for alumni interviews. My father took days off work to drive me to campus visits. My mother proofread every essay. Meanwhile, Amber had dropped out of high school and moved in with a 25-year-old boyfriend. We saw less of her and Aunt Melissa, but their problems seemed to be a frequent topic of hushed conversations between my parents after they thought I'd gone to bed. She's in over her head this time, I overheard my mother saying one night. Melissa is at her wit's end. What does she expect us to do about it? My father replied, his voice tired. We can't force Amber into rehab if she doesn't want to go. I didn't think much of it at the time. My focus was on the future that was finally taking shape. The acceptances began rolling in, first from my safety schools, then from more prestigious universities. When the thick envelope from Cornell arrived, my parents threw a celebration dinner. My father opened a bottle of champagne and allowed me a glass. To Tyler, he toasted. The first Wilson to go to the Ivy League. I floated through the next few weeks on a cloud of anticipation and pride. I ordered Cornell merchandise, joined Facebook groups for incoming freshmen, and started researching dorm options. The only shadow on my happiness was the deadline for the enrollment deposit, $1,000 to secure my spot, due by May 1st. I'll take care of it this week, my father assured me in mid-April. Just need to move some money around. But as the deadline approached, he became increasingly evasive. It's handled, he'd say when I asked. Or, don't worry about it, I've got it covered. April 28th arrived, and I still hadn't received confirmation that the deposit had been paid. I found my father in his home office, staring at his computer screen with uncharacteristic intensity. Dad, we need to send in the deposit today, I said. The deadline's in 3 days, and they recommend allowing time for processing. He startled slightly as if he'd forgotten I was in the house. Right. Listen, Tyler. We need to talk about Cornell. Something in his tone made my stomach drop. I sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair I'd sat in countless times for advice about school projects or discussions about my future. What about Cornell? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture I'd seen him make 1,000 times when delivering bad news to clients about failed home inspections or rejected offers. There's been a situation with the college fund. I waited, the silence stretching between us like a rubber band about to snap. Your cousin Amber is in trouble. Serious trouble this time. What did Amber have to do with my college fund? The connection seemed absurd, but a cold dread was already spreading through my chest. 3 months ago, she overdosed on heroin, he continued. She nearly died. After she was stabilized, the doctors recommended an intensive residential rehabilitation program. It's one of the best in the country, but it's expensive, very expensive, and not fully covered by insurance. I sat perfectly still, already seeing where this was heading, but unwilling to believe it. Aunt Melissa doesn't have that kind of money. She was desperate, talking about taking out high-interest loans that would have ruined her financially. Your mother and we made a decision. What kind of decision? My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. We used your college fund to pay for Amber's rehab. She's been there for 2 months now. The program lasts a year. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The words hit me like physical blows. My college fund. The money I'd been promised my entire life. The future I'd been working toward with every test, every project, every sacrifice. Gone. Spent on my cousin's rehab without even consulting me. All of it? I managed to ask. My father couldn't meet my eyes. Most of it. The rehab program costs $12,000 a month. The first 6 months had to be paid up front, plus a substantial deposit. I did the quick math. At least $84,000 gone. Probably more. Why? The word came out choked. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ask me? We knew how hard you'd worked for Cornell, he said, as if this explained everything. We didn't want to burden you with this decision. Your aunt and cousin needed immediate help. Amber could have died, Tyler. So you just took it? Money that was promised to me my whole life? Money that relatives gave specifically for my education? We're family, Tyler. Family takes care of family. Amber needed this more than I need a college education? My voice rose. More than I need the future you've been promising me for 18 years? Cornell isn't your only option, he said, finally looking at me. Your scholarship to Penn State is still available. It's a great school. And with student loans? Student loans? I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. You've always said we were saving so I wouldn't have to start my career buried in debt. This isn't how we wanted things to work out, he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of helplessness that only fueled my anger. But Amber's life was at stake. What would you have had us do? Let her die? It was a false choice, and even in my shocked state, I recognized the manipulation. There had been other options, a less expensive rehab program, a payment plan, contributions from other family members, a home equity loan. They hadn't explored any of them. Instead, they'd sacrificed my future because it was the easiest solution. You should have told me, I said, my voice dropping to almost a whisper. It was my money. My future. I deserved to know. We're still your parents, my father said, an edge entering his voice. That money was in our names, in an account we controlled. We made the best decision we could in a difficult situation. His words made it worse, not better. All these years, I'd believed. The college fund was mine, a promise, a guarantee. Now, with a few sentences, my father had redefined it as something they'd merely been allowing me to think was mine. So what am I supposed to do now? I asked. Cornell is expecting my deposit. Classes start in 4 months. We'll figure something out, he said, with the false confidence I'd heard him use with difficult clients. Maybe we can take out a parent loan for the first year, then reevaluate. Or you could start at Penn State and transfer later. But I wasn't a client he could placate with empty promises. I was his son, and he'd betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way. I walked out of his office without another word. In my bedroom, I stared at the Cornell acceptance letter I'd framed and placed proudly on my desk. The future it represented, the connections, the opportunities, the education I'd worked so hard for, seemed to be fading before my eyes like a photograph left in the sun. My mother found me there an hour later. She sat beside me on the bed, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I know you're angry," she began. "I'm not angry," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "I'm devastated, and I don't understand how you could do this without even talking to me first." "It all happened so quickly," she said, twisting her wedding ring the way she did when she was anxious. "Amber was in the hospital. The doctors were saying she needed immediate intervention. Melissa was falling apart. We had to make a decision. And I wasn't important enough to include in that decision." "Of course you're important." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "We were trying to protect you. You were in the middle of college applications, interviews. We didn't want to add to your stress. So instead, you waited until I'd gotten my hopes up, made plans, committed to Cornell, and now you tell me there's no money? How is that protecting me?" She had no answer for that. We sat in silence until she finally spoke again, her voice small. "We're going to make this right, Tyler. I promise. We'll find a way." But promises from my parents no longer held any weight. They'd shown me exactly how easily those promises could be broken when convenient. The next few days passed in a fog. I went through the motions at school, smiling blankly when teachers congratulated me on Cornell, changing the subject when classmates asked about fall plans. At home, I spoke to my parents only when necessary, retreating to my room immediately after dinner. My sister Haley tried to play peacemaker, but even she seemed uncomfortable with what our parents had done. "They should have told you," she whispered, one night, slipping into my room with a plate of cookies. "It wasn't fair." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." I called Cornell's financial aid office, explaining my situation in humiliating detail, asking if there were additional scholarships or grants available. The sympathetic administrator told me what I already knew. All major aid had been allocated months ago. She suggested deferring my admission for a year while I applied for private scholarships and loans. But deferring meant losing a year. It meant watching my classmates move forward while I stood still. And even with a year of aggressive scholarship applications, I'd never make up the shortfall. I was trapped in an impossible situation, created by the very people who should have been my strongest advocates. Then, 3 days after the bombshell, when the enrollment deposit was officially overdue, I received a text message from an unfamiliar number. "Tyler, it's Amber. Can we talk?" "Please." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "About what?" Her reply came quickly. "About what happened with your college money. I just found out. Please, I'm at Meadowbrook Rehabilitation Center. Visiting hours are 4-7 p.m. I should have ignored her. None of this was my problem. But curiosity, or maybe just the need for answers from someone other than my parents, got the better of me. "Fine. I'll be there at 5. Meadowbrook turned out to be a sprawling facility set on manicured grounds about an hour from home. I signed in at the security desk where they checked my ID and had me empty my pockets. A counselor escorted me to a bright solarium where patients could meet with visitors. Amber was waiting at a table by the window. She looked different from the last time I'd seen her, thinner, paler, with dark circles under her eyes. Her usual makeup was gone, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked younger somehow, and frighteningly vulnerable. "Thanks for coming," she said, as I sat across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I replied honestly. "What did you want to talk about?" She took a deep breath. "I found out yesterday what Uncle David and Aunt Elaine did, using your college fund for my rehab. My mom let it slip during her visit. She thought I knew." I said nothing, waiting. "I had no idea, Tyler. You have to believe that. I would never have agreed to come here if I'd known they were taking your future to pay for it." "Yet here you are," I observed, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "I was unconscious when they made the decision," she said quietly. "I woke up in the hospital with a tube down my throat. The next thing I knew, I was being transferred here." No one mentioned how it was being paid for. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or deceit. I'd grown up watching Amber lie to get out of trouble, but all I saw was genuine distress. "I'm sorry," she continued when I didn't respond. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. You worked so hard. You deserve Cornell." "Why did you want to see me?" I asked. "Just to apologize?" She hesitated. "Partly, but also, I wanted you to know that I'm getting better, that the program is working. I've been clean for 63 days. I'm doing the work. I know it doesn't make up for what happened to you, but I didn't want you to think your sacrifice was being wasted. My sacrifice. As if I'd made a choice." "Are there other ways this place could have been paid for?" I asked. "Other programs that cost less?" She nodded slowly. "There are state-funded programs. They're not as comprehensive, and there's usually a waiting list, but they exist. And some private facilities offer financial aid or payment plans." Just as I'd suspected. My parents hadn't explored all the options. They'd taken the fastest, easiest route, at my expense. "Why this place?" "It's one of the best," she said. "And they had an immediate opening. The doctor who treated me in the ER has connections here." He pulled some strings. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the sunlight filter through the trees outside. "What are you going to do now?" she finally asked. "About college?" It was the question I'd been asking myself, for days with no clear answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "The money's gone. Cornell's deposit deadline has passed. I'll probably end up at Penn State with my scholarship, if they'll still have me." "I'm so sorry," she said again, her eyes filling with tears. "This isn't right." No, it wasn't right. But hearing her acknowledge that, having someone finally validate my feelings instead of explaining why I should accept this injustice, loosened something tight in my chest. We talked for another hour. Not about the money or college, but about her addiction, how it started, where it had taken her. She spoke with a raw honesty I'd never seen from her before. For the first time, I saw my cousin as a complete person, not just the family problem child. As I was leaving, she grabbed my hand. "Tyler, there's something else you should know. This program, it's helping me, but it's not miracle workers. This real work happens after I leave here. And the success rates?" She trailed off, then forced herself to continue. "Relapse is common. I'm doing everything I can to stay clean, but there are no guarantees." Her words stayed with me during the silent drive home. No guarantees. $84,000 of my future spent on a program that might not even work. The unfairness of it all hit me anew, along with a growing resolve. I needed to protect whatever was left of my future. The next morning, I skipped school, for the first time in my academic career. Instead, I drove to the small law office downtown where my debate team volunteer coach, Mr. Grayson, worked as an attorney. His secretary showed me in immediately, concerned by my unexpected appearance. "Tyler," he said, rising from behind his desk, "is everything all right?" "No," I answered honestly. "And I need legal advice." I told him everything: the college fund, my parents' decision, the missed deposit deadline, my visit with Amber. He listened without interruption, taking occasional notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, with a somber expression. I understand why you're upset, Tyler. What your parents did was problematic, both ethically and potentially legally. But I need to ask, what outcome are you hoping for here? It was a good question. What did I want? Revenge? My money back? Neither seemed fully possible. I want to secure whatever's left of the college fund so they can't touch it, I said finally. And I want to know if there's any way to recover what was spent, or at least establish that I'm entitled to it. I've worked my whole life for this opportunity, Mr. Grayson. I can't just let it disappear. He nodded thoughtfully. Let me look into a few things. College funds can be structured in different ways, with different legal implications. I'll need to know exactly how yours was set up. Thank you, I said, relief washing over me at having someone competent in my corner. What do I owe you for? Your time? He waved away the question. Consider this pro bono for now. You volunteered countless hours helping the debate team. It's my turn to help you. As I stood to leave, he added, Tyler, I know you're hurt and angry. You have every right to be. But think carefully about your next steps. Legal battles with family can have consequences beyond the courtroom. I understand, I said. But they didn't think about the consequences when they took my future. I drove home with a strange mix of emotions, anger, determination, and underneath it all, a deep sadness for what had been lost. Not just the money, but the trust, the security, the belief that my parents would always put my needs first. Little did I know that my visit to Mr. Grayson was just the first step in a journey that would transform not just my future, but my entire understanding of family, obligation, and justice. I returned home from Mr. Grayson's office to find my mother waiting in the kitchen, her face tight with concern. The school called, she said. You weren't in your morning classes. I set my car keys on the counter with deliberate calm. I had something important to take care of. More important than school, with graduation just weeks away. She crossed her arms. Where were you, Tyler? For a moment, I considered lying. It would have been easier, would have bought me time. But I was done with the secrecy that had permeated our family. I was talking to a lawyer. The color drained from her face. A lawyer? About what? About my college fund. About what you and Dad did. She sank into a kitchen chair, her shoulders slumping. Oh, Tyler, it didn't have to come to this. Yes, it did, I countered. You gave me no choice. You took my future without even discussing it with me. We're trying to make it right, she insisted. Your father's looking into parent loans, and I've called Cornell to explain the situation. You called Cornell? The violation felt fresh. Without telling me? What exactly did you tell them? Just that we're having unexpected financial difficulties and need an extension on the deposit deadline. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I thought I was helping. You don't get to decide that anymore, I said quietly. Not after what you did. The front door opened, and my father walked in, home early from the office. One look at my mother's face told him something was wrong. What's going on? He asked, setting down his briefcase. Tyler went to see a lawyer today, my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. My father's expression hardened. A lawyer? Really, Tyler? That's your response to a family crisis? My response to you stealing my college fund, I corrected, and lying about it until it was too late to do anything. We did not steal from you. His voice rose. We made a difficult decision in an emergency situation. A decision you had no right to make without me. We're your parents. We have every right to destroy my future, to break promises you've been making my entire life. He ran a hand through his graying hair. This is exactly why we didn't tell you sooner. We knew you'd react emotionally instead of understanding the bigger picture. The bigger picture? I laughed, a hollow sound. You mean Amber? I visited her. Yesterday. Did you know that? She told me there were other programs, less expensive options, payment plans. But you didn't explore any of those, did you? You took the easiest route, at my expense. My parents exchanged a glance loaded with meaning. You visited Amber? My mother asked. How did you even know where she was? She texted me. She wanted to apologize, which is more than either of you have done. We have nothing to apologize for, my father insisted. We made the best decision we could in an impossible situation. Then I'm making the best decision I can in my impossible situation, I replied. I'm finding out if what you did was legal and if there's any way to recover what's left of my money. Your money? My father's face flushed with anger. That account was in our names. We opened it. We managed it. For my education, I interrupted. Every birthday card, every Christmas check from relatives was explicitly for my college fund. You were custodians, not owners. Something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition that I might have legal ground to stand on. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish here, Tyler? His tone shifted to the reasonable, logical one he used in negotiations. Do you want to tear this family apart over money? Force us to pull Amber out of rehab when she's finally making progress? The manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. Don't put this on me. You created this situation. I'm just trying to salvage what I can of my future. By threatening legal action against your own parents? My mother's voice cracked. We raised you better than this. You raised me to believe that hard work pays off, that promises matter, that honesty is essential, I countered. Then you undermined every one of those values when it became inconvenient. An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. My sister Haley appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. What's happening? She asked, her gaze darting between us. Nothing for you to worry about, our mother said quickly. But I was done with the family secrets. Mom and Dad took my college fund to pay for Amber's rehab, and now they're upset that I'm consulting a lawyer about it. Haley's eyes widened. All of it? Even the money from Grandma and Grandpa? My father's jaw tightened. This isn't a family vote, Haley. The decision has been made. What about my college fund? She asked, her voice small. Is it gone too? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I watched my parents' faces carefully and saw the quick glance they exchanged. Your fund is intact, my father finally said. But this isn't about, so just my future was sacrificed, I interrupted. Not Haley's. That's not fair, my mother protested. The situations are completely different. Your fund was mature, available. Haley still has years to grow. And 4 years from now, when she's ready for college, will her fund suddenly become available for the next family emergency? Haley looked stricken. My father pointed toward the door. That's enough, Tyler. This conversation is over. We'll discuss this when everyone's calmer. No, we won't, I said. Because there's nothing left to discuss. I've made my decision just like you made yours. I walked out of the kitchen, ignoring my mother's tearful plea to stay and talk. In my room, I pulled out my phone and texted Mr. Grayson. I told my parents. They're not backing down. How soon can we meet again? His response came within minutes. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Bring any paperwork you have related to the college fund. Statements, gifts, communications about its purpose. That night, I barely slept, listening to my parents' muffled voices arguing downstairs. Around midnight, my door creaked open, and Haley slipped into my room. Are you really suing Mom and Dad? She whispered, perching on the edge of my bed. I don't know yet, I admitted. I'm exploring my options. She hugged her knees to her chest. Everything's falling apart. I know. I sat up, leaning against the headboard. But I didn't cause this. Haley? They did. I heard them talking after you went upstairs, she said hesitantly, about taking out a second mortgage to pay you back. The information should have made me feel vindicated. Instead, it just underscored how badly they'd mishandled everything. Why didn't they do that in the first place? I asked. Instead of taking my college fund? I don't know. She twisted a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit from childhood. But if they pay you back, will you drop the lawyer thing? I sighed. It's not that simple anymore. Even if they could replace the money immediately, which I doubt, the deadline for Cornell has passed. I've lost my spot. Maybe you could start in the spring semester, or defer for a year? Maybe. But we both knew it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about trust, about autonomy, about the realization that my parents didn't view me as an individual with rights, but as an extension of themselves, someone whose future could be reallocated at their discretion. I don't want to take sides, Haley said quietly. I'm not asking you to. I squeezed her hand. This is between me and them. But as she slipped back out of my room, I knew that was a lie. In families, there are no isolated conflicts. Every fracture affects the whole structure. The next morning, I left for Mr. Grayson's office before my parents were awake, taking with me a folder of college fund statements, cards from relatives explicitly mentioning educational gifts, and the Cornell acceptance package. His secretary showed me around immediately. Mr. Grayson was already at his desk, reviewing notes from our previous meeting. I've been doing some research, he said without preamble. Based on what you've told me, it sounds like your college fund was set up as a custodial account under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. What does that mean? It means the money was legally yours, but controlled by your parents as custodians until you reach a certain age, usually 18 or 21, depending on your state's laws. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest. So they didn't have the right to use it for Amber? Not strictly speaking, no. Custodians are legally obligated to manage these accounts for the benefit of the minor, in this case, you. Using the funds for another person, even a family member, likely constitutes a breach of their fiduciary duty. I tried to process this information. So what can we do? We have several options. He counted them off on his fingers. 1. We send a formal demand letter outlining the legal issues and requesting full restitution. This puts them on notice without immediately filing a lawsuit, and if they ignore it, then we move to option 2, filing a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty and conversion, essentially the misappropriation of your funds. Or 3, we could report this to the district attorney's office as potential financial exploitation of a minor, which could lead to criminal charges. My stomach lurched at the thought of my parents facing criminal charges. Despite everything, they were still my parents. I don't want to go nuclear, I said slowly. I just want what's rightfully mine. Mr. Grayson nodded approvingly. Let's start with the demand letter then. It's the least aggressive approach and gives them an opportunity to make this right without court involvement. He pulled out a legal pad and began drafting, asking me occasional questions about account details and timelines. As I watched him work, a heavy weight settled in my chest. This was really happening. I was taking legal action against my own parents. What's likely to happen next? I asked as he finished the draft. Once they receive this, they'll probably consult their own attorney. If they're smart, that attorney will advise them to negotiate a settlement. He removed his glasses, polishing them with a cloth. But I should warn you, Tyler, family legal disputes often get messy. Are you prepared for that? Was I? I thought. About the last few days. The shattered trust. The realization that my parents viewed my future as a resource they could reallocate at will. I don't have a choice, I said finally. They've already shown they won't do the right thing unless forced. Mr. Grayson studied me for a moment, then nodded. I'll finalize this letter and send it to your parents this afternoon. In the meantime, I suggest you find somewhere else to stay for a few days. The initial reaction to something like this can be volatile. I hadn't considered that. Where would I go? Most of my friends' parents were friendly with mine. News would spread quickly in our small town. Then I remembered my debate team co-captain, Zach, whose family owned a lake house about an hour away. They rarely used it except in summer. I might have a place, I told Mr. Grayson, but I need to graduate in 3 weeks. I can't just disappear. I'm not suggesting you run away, he clarified. Just give everyone some breathing room while the initial shock wears off. You can still attend school, still graduate. Just minimize the conflict at home until we see how they respond to the letter. I nodded, already texting Zach to ask about the lake house. His reply came quickly. Sure thing. Parents never go there before Memorial Day. Keys under the ceramic frog by the back door. Stay as long as you need. As I left Mr. Grayson's office, I felt oddly calm. For the first time since learning about what my parents had done, I was taking concrete action rather than simply reacting. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, but it was the one they'd forced me onto. I drove straight to the lake house without returning home for clothes or toiletries. I could buy what I needed, and I wasn't ready to face my parents again before they received the letter. The modest cabin sat on a wooded lot overlooking a small lake, isolated enough that neighbors wouldn't notice an unexpected visitor. Inside, I found a slightly musty but clean interior with basic furnishings. I opened windows to air it out, then made a quick trip to the nearest grocery store for supplies. By late afternoon, I was settled in with a makeshift dinner of sandwich and chips, waiting for the inevitable call. It came at 5:47 p.m. My father's name flashed on my phone screen. I let it ring through to voicemail. A text followed immediately. "Where are you? We need to talk." "Now." I didn't respond. 10 minutes later, my mother called, then Haley. I silenced my phone and tried to focus on the homework I'd brought with me. AP exams were still happening, regardless of family drama. Around 7:30, headlights swept across the cabin's front window. I tensed, wondering if they'd somehow tracked me here. But the car continued past on the main road. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from Haley. "They got some legal letter. Dad's furious. Mom's crying. Please call me back." I typed. A quick response. "I'm safe. Need space right now. Don't worry." At 9:15, an email arrived from Mr. Grayson. "Tyler, your parents' attorney, James Feldman, called my office. He's requested a meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m. to discuss the matter. This is a positive sign. It means they're taking the legal issues seriously rather than dismissing them. I'll call you in the morning to prepare." I should have felt relieved. Instead, a wave of exhaustion hit me. I'd been running on adrenaline and righteous anger for days. Now, faced with the reality of sitting across a table from my parents and their lawyer, the emotional toll caught up with me. I slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of showing up late to exams and wandering empty Cornell hallways looking for classrooms that didn't exist. Morning brought a gray drizzle that matched my mood. Mr. Grayson called at 10 a.m. as promised. "How are you holding up?" he asked after I answered. "I've been better," I admitted. "What should I expect today?" "They'll likely start with an attempt to dismiss the legal validity of our claims," he explained. "When that fails, they'll probably pivot to emotional appeals, family loyalty, the need for unity, portraying you as ungrateful or selfish." It stung to hear it laid out so bluntly, but I appreciated his honesty. "What's our goal for the meeting?" I asked. "Ideally, a formal acknowledgement that they wrongfully used your funds, followed by a commitment to full restitution with a clear payment schedule. And if they refuse, then we proceed with the civil suit. But let's not borrow trouble. Many cases like this settle once the parties understand the legal realities." After we hung up, I showered and dressed in the clothes I'd purchased yesterday, khakis and a button-down shirt, the closest I could get to professional attire at the local department store. I was determined to present myself as a rational adult, not an emotional teenager. The law office where we were meeting was in the neighboring town of Riverside, a neutral location chosen by both attorneys. I arrived 15 minutes early, parking my car where it wouldn't be immediately visible from the street. The last thing I needed was my parents confronting me in the parking lot. Mr. Grayson was already inside, reviewing documents in a small conference room. He stood when I entered, shaking my hand with a firm grip that conveyed confidence. "Remember," he said quietly, "stay calm regardless of what they say. Let me do most of the talking, but be prepared to answer direct questions honestly and concisely." I nodded, trying to ignore the churning in my stomach. The door opened, and a middle-aged man in an expensive suit entered. "Jim Feldman," he introduced himself, shaking hands with Mr. Grayson and nodding to me. "The Wilsons are just parking." My parents entered a moment later. The shock of seeing them hit harder than I'd expected. My mother looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes red-rimmed and her usually perfect hair hastily pulled back. My father's face was set in the stern expression he used when particularly displeased with a business associate. Neither of them spoke to me directly. They took seats opposite us, flanking their attorney, a united front against their own son. Mr. Feldman cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I want to say that the Wilsons are deeply distressed by this situation. They're hoping we can resolve this matter quickly and privately, for everyone's benefit." "That's our hope as well," Mr. Grayson replied smoothly. "Provided, of course, that your clients acknowledge their legal obligations and commit to making my client whole." "Let's be clear," Mr. Feldman countered. "The account in question was legally controlled by the Wilsons as custodians. They made a decision they believed was in the best interests of their family as a whole." "A custodial account isn't a family slush fund," Mr. Grayson pointed out. "It's held in trust for a specific beneficiary, in this case, Tyler. Using those funds for another individual, regardless of the circumstances, constitutes a clear breach of fiduciary duty." My father leaned forward. "This is ridiculous. We're talking about saving Amber's life, not buying a vacation home." "David," Mr. Feldman cautioned, placing a restraining hand on my father's arm. He turned back to us. "The Wilsons understand there's a legal issue here. They're prepared to discuss restitution. However, they need time to arrange their finances." "We've outlined our requirements in the demand letter," Mr. Grayson replied. "Full restitution of the misappropriated funds, plus interest, on a payment. Schedule not to exceed 12 months. My mother spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have that kind of money liquid. Not without selling the house. You seem to have it liquid when you spent it on Amber's rehab," I said, unable to maintain my silence any longer. "Tyler," Mr. Grayson cautioned. "No, let him speak," my father said, his eyes locking with mine. "Let's hear what he has to say to justify tearing this family apart over money." "This isn't about money," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice remained. "It's about trust. It's about the fact that you made a unilateral decision to sacrifice my future without even discussing it with me. It's about you treating me as a child with no rights when it's convenient, then expecting me to act like an adult now that there are consequences. You have no idea what it's like," my mother burst out. "Watching your niece destroy herself, knowing she could die any day from an overdose. What were we supposed to do? Let her die because your college fund was sacred?" "You were supposed to talk to me," I said simply. "To treat me with enough respect to include me in a decision that fundamentally altered my future. You were supposed to explore all options, not just the easiest one at my expense." "Enough," Mr. Feldman interrupted. "This emotional back and forth isn't productive. Let's focus on finding a resolution." For the next hour, the attorneys negotiated while my parents and I sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence. Finally, Mr. Feldman laid out a proposal. "The Wilsons will acknowledge their legal error in using the custodial funds without proper authority. They'll commit to full restitution over a 24-month period, with payments to begin immediately. In return, Tyler agrees not to pursue further legal action, civil or criminal. Mr. Grayson looked at me. We'll need to discuss this privately. We stepped out into the hallway, moving far enough away that we couldn't be overheard. What do you think? He asked. 24 months is a long time, I said. By then, I'll be halfway through college, wherever I end up going. True, but they're acknowledging wrongdoing and committing to full repayment. That's significant. He adjusted his glasses. We could push for a shorter time frame, but if they truly don't have the liquidity, it might force them into more drastic measures, like selling their home. Despite everything, I didn't want that. I wasn't looking to destroy my parents financially, just to recover what was rightfully mine. What about Cornell? I asked. The deadline passed. Even with repayment, that opportunity is gone. That's something we could potentially address separately, he suggested. Ask for their assistance in contacting Cornell's admissions office, explaining the situation, and seeing if your acceptance can be deferred or reinstated. I nodded slowly. Okay, let's counter with 18 months for full repayment and add the Cornell stipulation. When we returned to the conference room, Mr. Grayson presented our counteroffer. My parents exchanged glances, then nodded to their attorney. That's acceptable, Mr. Feldman said. We'll have the agreement drawn up immediately. As the meeting concluded, my mother finally addressed me directly. Will you come home now? Please? I hesitated, looking to Mr. Grayson for guidance. That's entirely Tyler's decision, he said carefully. But I'd suggest everyone take a day or two to process before resuming cohabitation. Emotions are still raw. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I realized then that in his mind, the legal resolution should have immediately restored family harmony, as if a breach of trust could be repaired with a signature on a document. I need some time, I told my mother. I'll let you know when I'm ready to come back. As I walked to my car, Mr. Grayson beside me, I felt hollow rather than victorious. I'd won the legal battle, but at what cost? The relationship with my parents was damaged in ways that might never fully heal. What happens now? I asked as we reached the parking lot. Now we monitor compliance with the agreement, he replied. And you focus on finishing school, exploring your college options, and taking care of yourself. It sounded so simple laid out like that, but I knew the reality would be far messier. This was just the beginning of a long, painful process of redefining my relationship with my family and my understanding of myself. What I didn't know then was that the most shocking revelation was still to come. I stayed at Zach's family lake house for 3 more days after the meeting with the lawyers. Each morning, I drove to school, went through the motions of classes, and avoided the curious stares of classmates who'd somehow caught wind that something was happening with the Wilsons. Small towns and their gossip networks never ceased to amaze me. My parents respected my request for space, though my mother sent daily texts checking on me. Haley visited me at school during lunch breaks, bringing homemade cookies and updates from home. Dad's meeting with the bank about a home equity loan, she told me on Thursday, picking at her cafeteria salad. Mom's been going through old photo albums every night, crying. The information was clearly meant to make me feel guilty. I didn't ask them to take out a loan, I pointed out. That was their choice, just like using my college fund was their choice. I know, she sighed. I'm not taking sides, Tyler. I'm just telling you what's happening. But her report bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Despite everything, I didn't want my parents to suffer. I just wanted what was rightfully mine. That afternoon, after my last class, I found Mr. Blake, my guidance counselor, waiting by my locker. Tyler, he said, his expression serious. Can we talk in my office for a few minutes? I followed him down the empty hallway, wondering what this was about. Had my parents involved the school in our dispute? The thought made my stomach clench. Once, his office door closed behind us, Mr. Blake got straight to the point. I received a call from Cornell's admissions office this morning. They wanted to verify some information about your financial situation. I straightened in my chair. My parents actually contacted them? Apparently so. He consulted a notepad on his desk. They've explained that there was a temporary financial emergency that's now being resolved. Cornell is considering reinstating your acceptance for the fall semester, provided you can make the deposit by next Friday. A surge of hope rushed through me, followed immediately by suspicion. Why wouldn't Cornell contact me directly, or my parents? They're following up through official channels, verifying your academic standing hasn't changed, checking that there are no disciplinary issues they should be aware of. He studied me over his reading glasses. Tyler, I don't know what's going on between you and your parents, but this seems like a genuine effort on their part to make things right. Was it? Or was it a strategic move to gain leverage in our ongoing conflict? The agreement we'd signed required them to help me approach Cornell about reinstatement, but I hadn't expected them to act so quickly. Thank you for letting me know, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Is there anything I need to do? Just stay on track for graduation. I've already confirmed you're in good standing. He hesitated, then added, and maybe consider reaching out to your parents. Whatever's happening, they're clearly trying to fix it. I nodded non-committally and left his office, my thoughts in turmoil. If Cornell reinstated my acceptance, I'd need the first deposit immediately, plus tuition payments starting in late summer. The agreement with my parents specified monthly payments over 18 months, not a lump sum up front. Had they set this up deliberately, creating a situation where I'd need to rely on them beyond our legal agreement? Or was I becoming paranoid, seeing manipulation in what might genuinely be an attempt to make amends? I was still pondering this when my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Tyler, it's Aunt Melissa. We need to talk. It's important. My first instinct was to ignore it. I had enough Wilson family drama without adding my aunt to the mix, but curiosity won out. About what? Her response came immediately. About the college money and Amber. I just found out what's happening with you and your parents. Please give me 30 minutes. I sighed, already regretting engaging. When and where? I can meet you anywhere. Today, if possible. I suggested a coffee shop in Riverside, neutral territory, public enough that any emotional outbursts would be contained, but far enough from Mapleton to avoid local gossip. I'll be there at 5, I texted. As I drove to the meeting, I rehearsed what I might say. I hadn't seen Aunt Melissa in months, not since before Amber's overdose. Our relationship had always been distant, defined more by awkward holiday interactions than any genuine connection. The coffee shop was half empty when I arrived. I spotted Aunt Melissa immediately, seated in a corner booth, fidgeting with a sugar packet. She looked older than I remembered. Her blonde hair, dyed the same shade as my mother's, showing dark roots, her face lined with worry. Tyler, she said, standing as I approached. Thank you for coming. I slid into the booth across from her, declining her awkward attempt at a hug. You said it was important. She nodded, her gaze direct despite her obvious nervousness. I need to tell you something about Amber's rehab situation, something I just found out myself. A server appeared to take our order. I asked for black coffee, Melissa for herbal tea. When we were alone again, she leaned forward. Tyler, I didn't know your parents used your college fund for Amber's treatment. Not until yesterday, when Elaine finally told me what was happening with you. Okay, I said, unsure where this was going. Would it have made a difference if you'd known? Yes. Her vehemence surprised me. I would never have allowed it. Never. The I. Server returned with our drinks. Melissa wrapped her hands around her mug but didn't drink. When Amber overdosed, I was a mess, she continued after the server left. The doctor said she needed intensive treatment, long-term. Your parents offered to help find a facility to handle the arrangements while I focused on Amber's immediate medical needs. She took a shaky breath. They told me they'd found a place that would accept our insurance plus a reasonable monthly payment from me. I've been sending them $800 every month, nearly half my paycheck from the salon, thinking that was covering Amber's treatment along with insurance. I sat very still, processing her words. You've been paying them? She nodded. I thought they were just helping with the paperwork, maybe covering some incidentals. I had no idea they'd used your college money. No idea the program cost so much more than what I was paying. How much does the program actually cost? I asked, though I already knew the answer from my father's confession. $12,000 a month, apparently. She shook her head in disbelief. Elaine finally told me yesterday when she called to say they needed me to take over the full payments because they were in financial trouble due to some legal situation with you. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. My parents hadn't just taken my college fund without telling me. They'd concealed the truth from Melissa as well, allowing her to believe she was covering Amber's treatment while they diverted my educational savings. Did you ask them why they didn't tell you the real cost from the beginning? I asked. Or look for a more affordable program? Of course I did. Elaine said they didn't want me to worry that they were handling it as a family. She made air quotes around the phrase, her expression bitter. But they weren't handling it. They were spending your future without anyone's knowledge or consent. I sat back, trying to absorb this new layer of deception. It was one thing to make a desperate decision in a family crisis. It was another to deliberately mislead multiple family members about that decision. There's more, Melissa said quietly. When I realized what was happening, I called the rehab facility directly. I wanted to understand the payment situation, maybe work out a different arrangement now that I know the true cost. She paused, her hands tightening around her mug. The administrator I spoke with was confused. She checked their records and said, Amber's program is being covered by insurance plus a $2,500 monthly fee, which has been paid in full through June. I frowned, doing the math. $2,500? Not $12,000? Exactly. Her eyes met mine, anger flashing in their blue depths. I don't know if your parents were misinformed about the cost or if they deliberately lied, but something doesn't add up. Even with my $800 monthly contribution, there's a huge discrepancy between what they claimed the program cost and what the facility says they're being paid. The implications were staggering. Either my parents had been duped by the rehab facility, highly unlikely given my father's business acumen, or they had inflated the cost to justify taking more of my college fund than necessary. Have you confronted them about this? I asked. Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, to understand what's been happening from your perspective. She reached across the table, stopping just short of touching my hand. Tyler, I'm so sorry. I would never have allowed them to use your future to help Amber, especially not without your knowledge. I believed her. Despite our distant relationship, Aunt Melissa had always struck me as straightforward, sometimes to a fault. She lacked my mother's social polish, but also her capacity for subtle manipulation. What are you going to do now? I asked. I'm going to take over Amber's treatment costs completely. The real costs, not whatever inflated figure your parents cited. And I'm going to demand answers about where the rest of the money went. Her jaw set in a determined line that reminded me, fleetingly, of my mother. But I wanted to see you first, to tell you directly that I had no part in this deception. As she spoke, my phone buzzed with an incoming email. I glanced down to see Mr. Grayson's name in the preview. Excuse me, I said, opening the message. Tyler, I've received the first installment from your parents per our agreement. $5,600 has been deposited into the account we established. Please confirm the receipt. At least they were honoring that part of our agreement. But given what Aunt Melissa had just revealed, I was now wondering exactly how much of my college fund had actually gone to Amber's treatment and how much might have been diverted elsewhere. Tyler? Melissa prompted. Are you okay? I looked up from my phone, my thoughts racing. My parents just made their first repayment installment, according to my lawyer. That's good, right? I don't know anymore. I ran a hand through my hair, a gesture I'd unconsciously adopted from my father. If what you're saying is true, they've been lying about more than just taking my money. They've been lying about how much they took and where it went. She nodded grimly. That's why I wanted to meet in person. This goes beyond a well-intentioned but misguided decision. This looks deliberate. As the implications sank in, a cold anger replaced my initial shock. I need to talk to my lawyer again. I understand. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. This is the name and direct number of the administrator I spoke with at Meadowbrook. She said she's happy to verify the payment information, if needed. I took the card, tucking it into my wallet. Thank you for telling me the truth. It's the least I could do. She hesitated, then added, I know we've never been close, Tyler. I've always been the family screw-up compared to your mom. The single mother, the one who couldn't keep a steady job or a husband. But I would never steal from a child's future. And I would never let Amber's problems become your burden without your consent. For the first time, I saw my aunt clearly, not as the embarrassing relation we tolerated at family gatherings, but as someone who had struggled and persevered, who was doing her best with limited resources and support. What will happen with Amber if you take over the payments? I asked. Can you afford it? I've been saving to move to a better apartment, but that can wait. Amber's health comes first, and $2,500 is steep but manageable if I pick up weekend shifts. She gave a small, determined smile. We'll make it work. We always do. As we parted ways in the parking lot, she surprised me with one last revelation. Tyler, there's something else you should know. After I spoke with the rehab administrator, I called Amber to check on her. I mentioned what I'd learned about your college fund being used for her treatment. What did she say? She was horrified. She'd had no idea the money came from your college. Fund? Melissa's expression softened. She asked me to tell you she's coming up on 90 days sober, and she's dedicating her 9th step to you. I must have looked confused because she explained, in the 12-step program, the 9th step is making amends to people you've harmed. Amber feels like she owes you amends, even though the harm wasn't her doing. I nodded, unsure how to respond. My feelings toward Amber were complicated, a mix of resentment, pity, and a strange sense of connection forged by our shared victimization in this family drama. Tell her... I paused, finding the right words. Tell her I appreciate that, and I'm glad she's getting better. As I drove back to the lake house, my mind was spinning with this new information. What had seemed like a straightforward, if painful situation now appeared infinitely more complex and troubling. If my parents had lied about the cost of Amber's treatment, where had the rest of my college money gone? And why maintain the deception, even now? I pulled over at a scenic overlook, needing a moment to collect my thoughts before deciding my next move. The sun was setting over the lake, casting golden ripples across the water, the same lake I'd swum in every summer as a child, believing the world was simple and my parents were infallible. I dialed Mr. Grayson's number. Tyler, he answered on the second ring. I was just about to call you. Did you receive my email about the first payment? Yes, I said. But something's come up. I just met with my aunt, and she told me something disturbing about Amber's rehab costs. I explained what Melissa had revealed, the discrepancy between the $12,000 monthly fee my parents had claimed and the $2,500 the facility actually charged, plus the $800 Melissa had been contributing. A long silence followed. That's concerning, he finally said. If accurate, it suggests your parents may have misrepresented not just their actions, but the amount they misappropriated. What do we do? First, we verify. Can your aunt provide documentation from the rehab facility confirming the actual monthly cost? She gave me the contact information for the administrator she spoke with. Good. Have her request an official statement of account. In the meantime, I suggest we request detailed records of all withdrawals from your college fund over the past, 6 months. I thought we already had those, I said, confused. We have the summary statements your parents provided showing the total withdrawals. What we need now are the transaction details, dates, amounts, and destinations of each transfer. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, suddenly exhausted. If they lied about this, what else might they have lied about? Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Mr. Grayson cautioned. There may be an explanation. Additional costs they paid, services not reflected in the base rate. But yes, we need to investigate. After ending the call, I sat watching the sunset fade into twilight, a hollow feeling expanding in my chest. Just when I thought I'd grasped the full extent of my parents' betrayal, the ground had shifted again. I opened my contacts and scrolled to my father's number, hovering my thumb over it. Should I confront him directly? Demand answers about the cost discrepancy. But if he'd been willing to lie until now, why would he suddenly become truthful? Instead, I texted Haley, "Can you check something for me? Look in Dad's office for any paperwork related to Amber's rehab, bills, receipts, insurance documents." Her response came quickly. "Why? What's going on? Please just trust me. It's important. They're not home. Dinner with the Hendersons. I'll look when it's safe." I drove back to the lake house, trying to focus on practical next steps rather than the emotional turmoil threatening to overwhelm me. I had AP exams next week, graduation soon after. I needed to keep it together. Around 9:30, my phone buzzed, with another text from Haley. Found a folder labeled Meadowbrook in Dad's desk, taking pictures now. 5 minutes later, my phone lit up with a series of incoming images: admission paperwork, payment records, insurance forms. I forwarded them to Mr. Grayson, then examined them myself. There it was in black and white. Monthly program fee, $2,500. Initial assessment and placement fee, $4,000. Nothing about $12,000 per month. Nothing that would justify the massive withdrawal from my college fund. Another text from Haley. There's something else. Found bank statements for an account I don't recognize. Lots of transfers. More images appeared on my screen. Statements from Mapleton Community Bank for an account in my father's name only. Large deposits corresponding roughly to the time frame when my college fund had been drained, followed by transfers to various recipients I didn't recognize. One name caught my eye: Evergreen Investments. I Googled it quickly, finding a local investment firm specializing in commercial real estate development. Why was my father transferring money to an investment firm when he claimed to be using it for Amber's rehab? As I stared at the evidence of what appeared to be a deliberate, calculated deception, a cold clarity washed over me. This wasn't a desperate decision made in a family emergency. This was something much worse. My phone rang. Haley. I have to. Put everything back, she whispered. They just pulled into the driveway. But Tyler, what's going on? Why does Dad have this separate account? I don't know yet, I said honestly. But I'm going to find out. Put everything back exactly as you found it, and don't let them know you were looking. I'm scared, she admitted. This feels really wrong. It is wrong, I replied. But we're going to fix it. I promise. After we hung up, I forwarded the bank statement images to Mr. Grayson with a brief message. Found this. Appears Dad may have diverted college fund money to investments rather than Amber's treatment. Call me in the morning. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for days. I drove back to Mapleton, to the house I'd grown up in, parking at the curb rather than in the driveway. The windows glowed with warm light against the darkness. The Hendersons' car still in our driveway, indicating the dinner guests hadn't left yet. I didn't go inside. Instead, I sat watching the house where I'd always felt safe and protected, trying to reconcile my lifetime of trust with this new reality of deception. Who were these people who had raised me? Has anything they'd ever told me been true? As I watched, shadowy figures moved past the dining room window. My parents entertaining, maintaining appearances while their carefully constructed facade crumbled around them. They didn't know yet that I'd discovered this new layer of betrayal. They were still operating under the belief that our legal agreement had resolved everything, that their partial confession had been accepted. Tomorrow would change that. Tomorrow, I would demand the full truth, not just about the money, but about the web of lies they'd constructed around it. Tomorrow, they would understand that they hadn't just betrayed my trust, they'd shattered it beyond repair. For tonight, though, I simply sat in the darkness, mourning the loss of the family I thought I had, and steeling myself for the battle that lay ahead. I slept in my car that night, parked a block away from our house. It wasn't comfortable, but something kept me from returning to the lake house, a strange need to remain close to the epicenter of the deception I'd uncovered. Around dawn, I awoke stiff and disoriented, my phone buzzing with a text from Mr. Grayson? My office, 8 a.m., urgent. I drove to a gas station, splashed water on my face in the grimy bathroom, and bought the strongest coffee they had. By 7:55, I was pulling into the law office parking lot, trying to look more put together than I felt. Mr. Grayson wasn't alone. A stern-looking woman in a charcoal pantsuit sat across from his desk, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. She stood as I entered. "Tyler, this is Margaret Donovan," Mr. Grayson introduced her. "She's a forensic accountant I've worked with on several cases involving financial impropriety." We shook hands, her grip surprisingly strong for her slender frame. "Mr. Grayson shared the documents you forwarded last night," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I've done a preliminary analysis, and I have some concerns." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I already knew the answer wouldn't be good. She opened a laptop, turning it so I could see the screen. "Based on the bank statements your sister photographed, it appears your father has been making regular transfers to several entities that don't align with medical treatment expenses." She pointed to highlighted transactions. "Evergreen Investments is a commercial real estate development firm specializing in high-risk, high-reward property ventures. These other transfers went to what appears to be a private LLC registered in Delaware, typically a structure used to shield assets or investments from public view." My mouth went dry. "What does that mean?" Mr. Grayson leaned forward. "It means, Tyler, that there's strong evidence your father diverted a substantial portion of your college fund into personal investments, not just Amber's rehabilitation." "How much?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Ms. Donovan consulted her notes. "Without full access to all accounts, I can't give you an exact figure, but from what we can see, at least $60,000 appears to have gone to these investment vehicles rather than medical expenses." $60,000, more than half of my college fund, channeled not to Amber's treatment, but to my father's private investments. "Could it be legitimate?" I asked, grasping for any explanation that didn't involve deliberate theft. "Maybe he borrowed from my fund temporarily, planning to replace it with investment returns?" Ms. Donovan's expression softened slightly. "That's possible, but problematic for several reasons. First, custodians of UTME accounts aren't permitted to borrow from them for personal use, even temporarily. Second, if that was his intention, he should have disclosed it when confronted about the missing funds. Instead, according to your attorney, he explicitly stated the money went to your cousin's treatment, which we now know cost significantly less than he claimed," Mr. Grayson added. I stared out the window, watching a pair of robins build a nest in the oak tree outside. Such a normal, natural process, parents creating a safe place for their young. The contrast with my own situation felt surreal. "What do we do?" I finally asked. Mr. Grayson and Ms. Donovan exchanged glances. "That depends on what outcome you want," she said carefully. "If your goal is simply to recover your funds, we continue with the current agreement. but amend it to reflect the true amounts misappropriated. If, however, you believe this rises to the level of criminal misconduct. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The implication hung in the air between us. I could potentially pursue criminal charges against my own father for fraud and embezzlement. I need time to think, I said. Of course, Mr. Grayson nodded. But not too much time. The settlement agreement we signed operates under the assumption that your parents used the funds for Amber's treatment. If that proves substantially false, we should take action quickly. I left the office with my head spinning, unable to fully process the magnitude of what I'd learned. My father hadn't just made a misguided decision to help Amber at my expense. He'd deliberately misrepresented how much her treatment cost, apparently pocketing the difference for his own investments. And my mother? Had she known? Been complicit? The thought of both parents conspiring in this deception was almost too painful to contemplate. I drove aimlessly, eventually finding myself at Riverside Park where I'd played Little League baseball as a kid. My father had coached my team for 3 seasons, spending countless hours teaching me to hit a curveball, to field ground balls without flinching. He'd been patient, encouraging, the kind of coach other kids envied. Had that been genuine? Or just another performance in a lifetime of carefully maintained appearances? I sat on the bleachers, watching a group of elementary school kids having a PE class on the field, their laughter carrying across the spring air. My phone buzzed with a text from Haley. "Where are you? Mom and Dad are freaking out. Dad got a call from his bank this morning about unusual account inquiries. He knows something's up. So much for discretion." Apparently, Margaret Donovan's preliminary investigation had triggered security alerts on my father's accounts. Before I could respond, another text arrived. This one from my father. "We need to talk. Now. Come home." Not, "Please, come home." Not, "We're worried about you." Just a demand, an order, as if I were still a child who could be summoned at will. The audacity of it, after everything I now knew, ignited a spark of anger that quickly blazed into fury. I responded to Haley first. "I'm safe. Stay out of it for now. We'll explain later." Then to my father, after several attempts to craft the right message. "I know about Evergreen Investments. I know Amber's treatment costs $2,500 a month, not $12,000. I know you've been lying about where my money went. I'm not coming home until I have the full truth." His response was immediate. "This is a misunderstanding. Don't do anything rash. We can explain everything." Of course they could. They'd been explaining away their actions from the beginning, crafting narratives that cast themselves as concerned, responsible parents making difficult decisions for the greater good. How much of it had been true? I turned off my phone, needing space to think without the constant buzzing of texts and calls. The park was emptying now, the school kids loading onto a bus, the afternoon stretching quiet before me. What did I want? The question Mr. Grayson had posed echoed in my mind. Did I want justice? Revenge? Or just my money back and a chance to move forward? I thought about my cousin Amber, working through her recovery, dedicating her 9th step to me without even knowing the full extent of what had been done in her name. I thought about Aunt Melissa, scraping together $800 a month to help with treatment that cost far less than she'd been told. I thought about Haley, who might someday face her own version of this betrayal, if our parents' pattern of financial manipulation continued unchecked. And I thought about Cornell, the opportunity that still dangled just out of reach, contingent on a deposit I couldn't make without the money that had been taken from me. By late afternoon, I'd reached a decision. I drove to the only place I could think of where I might find unbiased counsel, my grandfather's house on the outskirts of Mapleton. Grandpa Wilson, my father's father, had maintained a careful distance from family conflicts over the years. A retired judge, he valued evidence over emotion, facts over accusations. He'd been widowed for a decade, but remained fiercely independent, living alone in the farmhouse where he'd been born 82 years earlier. He answered the door with a book in hand, barely registering surprise at my unexpected visit. "Tyler." He nodded, stepping aside to let me in. "Been wondering when you'd show up." The house smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, comfortingly familiar from countless Sunday dinners and summer visits throughout my childhood. "You've heard?" I asked as I followed him into the kitchen where a kettle whistled on the stove. "Bits and pieces," he replied, pouring hot water into a teapot. "Your father called yesterday, mentioned some legal unpleasantness over your college fund. Your mother stopped by this morning, crying about family loyalty and difficult choices." He set 2 mugs on the table, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Neither of them seemed inclined to give me the full story. "Thought you might." "So." "I did. I told him everything. The initial discovery about my college fund, the legal agreement, and now the evidence suggesting my father had diverted a significant portion of the money to personal investments while lying about Amber's treatment costs." Grandpa listened without interruption, his weathered face betraying no emotion beyond occasional nods of understanding. When I finished, he poured the tea before speaking. "Your father was always clever with money," he said finally. "Too clever sometimes. Gets caught up in the mechanics of it all. The percentages, the projections, the potential returns. Forgets there are people on the other end of those numbers." He took a slow sip of tea. Not surprised he'd see an opportunity in a family crisis. Disappointed, but not surprised. "What should I do?" I asked the same question I'd been asking everyone lately, hoping someone might have a clear answer. Grandpa considered this, his gaze drifting to the window where his apple orchard was just beginning to bloom. "When I was on the bench," he said, "I saw a lot of families torn apart over money, pride, betrayal. Once those fractures form, they rarely heal completely." He turned back to me, his blue eyes, the same shade as my father's, as mine, sharp, with clarity. "Legal remedies can recover financial losses, Tyler, but they can't restore trust. Can't make a father honest if he's chosen deception. Can't force accountability on someone who refuses to acknowledge wrongdoing." "So, I should just let it go?" I asked, frustration edging into my voice. "Didn't say that." He shook his head. "Just making sure you understand what the law can and can't fix. What do you want here beyond the money?" It was the 3rd time someone had asked me that question. This time, I had an answer. I want the truth. The whole truth. Not just the pieces they're willing to admit when cornered. I want them to face what they've done, not just to me, but to Aunt Melissa and Amber. And I want to make sure they can't do this to Haley when her turn comes. Grandpa nodded slowly. Truth and accountability. Worthy goals, though rarely achieved in full measure. He rose from the table, moving to an antique secretary desk in the corner. From a drawer, he withdrew a business card, yellowed with age. "Stanley Vance," he said, handing me the card. "Best forensic accountant in 3 counties. Testified in my courtroom more times than I can count. Retired now, but still consults occasionally for the right cases." I studied the card. "You think this qualifies as the right case?" "I think Stanley owes me a favor, and I think your father's financial maneuvering deserves professional scrutiny." His expression hardened slightly. "Family loyalty cuts both ways. Tyler, your parents invoked it to justify taking your future. I'm invoking it to help you reclaim it." He picked up the phone, dialing the number from memory rather than from the card. After a brief conversation, he handed me the receiver. "Mr. Wilson," a gruff voice greeted me. "Judge Wilson says you've got a situation that needs my particular skill set." "Yes, sir," I replied, suddenly nervous. "My parents misappropriated my college fund, claiming it went to my cousin's medical treatment, but I've found evidence suggesting much of it was diverted to my father's personal investments." "How much are we talking about?" "Around $84,000 total taken, with at least $60,000 potentially diverted to non-medical purposes. A low whistle came through the line. And you've got documentation? Partial. Bank statements showing transfers to investment entities, discrepancies between claimed medical costs and actual treatment charges. Judge says you already have legal representation? Yes, Lawrence Grayson in Riverside. Grayson's solid. He paused, and I could hear papers rustling. I can meet you tomorrow, 10 a.m. at Grayson's office. Bring whatever documentation you have and we'll map out a strategy. After hanging up, I turned to find my grandfather watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pride mixed with sadness, perhaps. This won't be easy, he warned. Your father won't take this challenge lying down. I know, I said. But I can't just pretend this didn't happen. I can't let them rewrite history to cast themselves as well-intentioned victims of circumstance. No, he agreed. You can't. Some lessons must be learned the hard way, even by parents. He offered me his guest room for the night, which I gratefully accepted. As I settled into the familiar space, surrounded by the same faded baseball pennants and nature photographs that had hung there since my childhood visits, my phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Grayson. Your parents' attorney called. They're requesting an urgent meeting tomorrow to clarify misunderstandings about fund allocation. I've scheduled for 2 p.m. after our meeting with Ms. Donovan. Are you available? I replied affirmatively, then turned my phone back off. Whatever explanations or justifications my parents were preparing, I needed to arm myself with facts first. Before sleep claimed me, I sent one last text to Cornell's admissions office, using the contact information Mr. Blake had provided. This is Tyler Wilson. I'm writing to inform you that I am working to resolve the financial situation that affected my enrollment deposit. I expect to have the matter settled within 2 weeks and would greatly appreciate your continued consideration of my admission status. It was a shot in the dark, but I needed to believe that my future at Cornell wasn't completely lost, that somewhere, beyond this mess of betrayal and deception, the path I'd worked so hard to create still existed. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect spring day that contrasted sharply with the storm I knew was coming. My grandfather drove me to Mr. Grayson's office, offering to wait in the lobby during my meetings. Moral support, he said simply, when I protested that it wasn't necessary. Sometimes just knowing someone's in your corner makes all the difference. Stanley. Vance turned out to be a wiry man in his 70s, with alert eyes and gnarled hands that moved with surprising dexterity across keyboards and papers. He wasted no time on pleasantries, diving straight into the documentation I'd provided. For the next hour, he fired questions at me, Ms. Donovan, and Mr. Grayson, building a comprehensive picture of my parents' financial maneuvers. His conclusions, when finally delivered, were damning. Based on the evidence available, I believe your father used approximately $20,000 for legitimate medical expenses related to your cousin's treatment. The remaining $64,000 appears to have been diverted to various investment vehicles, primarily commercial real estate development through Evergreen and a separate venture capital fund specializing in tech startups. He tapped a folder containing his preliminary findings. The pattern suggests deliberate misrepresentation, not mere oversight or temporary reallocation. The transfers were structured to obscure their origin and destination, a classic hallmark of financial impropriety. Mr. Grayson absorbed this with a grim nod. What would you recommend as next steps? Legally? Stanley glanced at his watch. Given that you're meeting with them in an hour, I'd advise full disclosure of what we've found, coupled with an amended demand for complete restitution of the misappropriated funds, not just the amount. They've already agreed to repay, he turned to me. But understand this, revealing what we know will likely escalate the situation significantly. Your father may face not just civil, but potentially criminal liability for misappropriation of custodial funds. The weight of that statement settled over the room. My father, the respected real estate broker, the Little League coach, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and balance a checkbook, could potentially face criminal charges because of my actions. Do I have other options? I asked. Stanley considered this. You could maintain the current agreement, accepting the partial repayment schedule without disclosing what you know about the investment diversions, essentially allowing them to continue, believing their partial confession has resolved the matter. That doesn't seem right, I said slowly. It's not about right or wrong at this point, he replied. It's about what you can live with. Some people choose family peace over full justice. That's a personal decision only you can make. I thought about my grandfather waiting in the lobby, about his words regarding truth and accountability. I thought about Haley, whose college fund might someday face the same fate if this behavior went unchallenged. I thought about all the years. I'd believed in my parents' integrity, only to discover it had limitations I'd never imagined. I want the full truth, I said finally, and complete restitution, whatever that takes. Stanley nodded, a hint of approval in his expression. Then, let's prepare for your meeting. They'll come with excuses, justifications, emotional appeals. We need to be ready with facts that can't be manipulated or denied. As we strategized for the confrontation ahead, I felt a strange calm settling over me. The shock and betrayal that had consumed me for days were giving way to a clear-eyed determination. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about establishing boundaries, demanding honesty, and refusing to accept manipulation disguised as parental authority. In just under an hour, I would face my parents across the conference table. This time, I wouldn't be caught off guard by their explanations or swayed by their emotional appeals. This time, I had the truth on my side, cold, hard, and undeniable. The reckoning was coming, and I was finally ready for it. What about your father? My grandfather's question hung in the air between us. I moved to the window, watching rain begin to fall on the parking lot below. The weather matched my mood, unsettled, gray, caught between storms. I don't know, I admitted. Legally, we have enough evidence for criminal charges. Mr. Grayson made that clear. But, my grandfather prompted, always able to hear the unspoken in my words. But he's still my father, and sending him to jail won't undo what's happened. My grandfather joined me at the window, his reflection appearing beside mine in the glass. There are options between full prosecution and complete forgiveness. Middle paths that might accomplish what you're really after. Which is what? You tell me, he said. What matters most to you now? Punishment, prevention, or rehabilitation? I considered the question carefully. Prevention, I think. Making sure this doesn't happen to Haley. Making sure he faces real consequences, but not destroying what's left of our family in the process. He nodded approvingly. Then let's talk about strategy. Over the next hour, my grandfather and I mapped out an approach that felt both just and measured. When Mr. Grayson returned from another meeting, we presented our plan. It's unorthodox, he said after listening to our proposal, but potentially effective for your specific goals. Can you make it happen? I asked. I can draft the agreement. Whether your father accepts it is another matter entirely. He'll accept it, my grandfather said with certainty. The alternative is far worse. That evening, I returned to the lake house to find Haley waiting on the porch. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Mom told me everything, she said as I sat beside her on the steps. About Dad taking your money for investments, not just for Amber, about lying to everyone. I nodded, unsure what to say. How do you discuss your father's criminal behavior with your younger sister? Is he going to jail? She asked bluntly. That depends on him, I replied. I've offered an alternative arrangement, but he has to agree to it. What kind of arrangement? I explained the terms I'd developed with my grandfather and Mr. Grayson. A legally binding agreement that would require my father to resign from his position at the real estate firm and disclose his actions to the state licensing board, Enter. Therapy to address his financial risk-taking and pattern of deception transfer. Legal control of Haley's college fund to our grandfather as trustee. Make full financial restitution to Aunt Melissa for the unnecessary payments she'd made. Perform 500 hours of community service with a financial literacy program for at-risk youth. Agree to periodic financial audits for the next 5 years. If he complies with all these terms, I concluded, I won't press criminal charges. Haley absorbed this in silence, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. It will destroy him to lose his career, she finally said. Real estate is everything to him. He destroyed that himself when he decided to embezzle my college fund, I pointed out, more sharply than I'd intended. Actions have consequences, Haley. That's what Dad always taught us, isn't it? She flinched but didn't argue. What about Mom? That's between them, I said. I can't fix their marriage, and I won't try. And what about us? You and me and Dad? Her voice trembled. Will we ever be okay again? I put my arm around her shoulders, wishing I could shield her from the painful reality. I don't know. That depends on a lot of things. Whether Dad can take responsibility without excuses, whether he can earn back our trust over time. I'm scared, she whispered. Everything's falling apart. Not everything, I assured her. Your future is secure. Now, Mom has made sure of that. And we still have each other. She leaned against me, and we sat watching the rain in silence until her phone buzzed with a text from our mother, asking her to come back to the hotel where they were staying. After Haley left, I called Mr. Grayson for an update. I've delivered the agreement to your father's attorney, he reported. He requested 24 hours to review it with his client. We should have an answer by tomorrow afternoon. And if he refuses? Then we proceed with filing a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office. The evidence is substantial. Tyler, your father would be facing felony charges. I thanked him and hung up, hoping it wouldn't come to that. Despite everything, I didn't want to see my father in handcuffs, his name in the local paper's crime section, his life permanently derailed. I wanted accountability, not destruction. The next morning, I received an unexpected text from Amber. Tyler, Mom told me what Uncle David really did with your college money. I'm so sorry. This wasn't your burden to bear. I'm 90 days clean today. And working my program hard. Whatever happens with your family, please know I'm grateful for your kindness, and I will make this up to you someday. I wrote back thanking her for the message and congratulating her on her sobriety milestone. Despite everything, I felt genuine happiness for her progress. She had been a pawn in my father's machinations as much as I had been. Her medical crisis, exploited as a convenient cover story. Around noon, Mr. Grayson called again. Your father has requested a meeting. Just you and him, no attorneys present. Warning bells immediately sounded in my mind. That doesn't seem wise. I agree, which is why I declined on your behalf. Either he meets with all parties present, or he provides his answer to the agreement through proper legal channels. I felt a rush of gratitude for Mr. Grayson's protectiveness. My father had manipulated me for years. I couldn't risk giving him an opportunity to do so again at this crucial juncture. His attorney just called back. Mr. Grayson continued. They've agreed to a meeting at my office at 3 o'clock. All parties present. I arrived early, nerves making it impossible to sit still. I paced the conference room while Mr. Grayson reviewed documents at the table. My grandfather had gone to pick up Haley from school. I'd decided she should be present, old enough at 16 to understand what was happening to our family and why. At precisely 3, the receptionist announced my father's arrival. He entered alone, his attorney apparently waiting in the lobby. Thank you for seeing me, he said, looking only at me, ignoring Mr. Grayson completely. I gestured to a chair across the table. You wanted to talk. I'm listening. He sat down heavily, the confident posture I'd observed my entire life now absent. Even his clothing seemed different. A simple button-down shirt rather than his usual crisp suit, his normally perfect hair uncombed. "I've reviewed your terms," he began, placing a folder on the table. "They're harsh, Tyler. Very harsh." "They're fair," I countered. "And considerably more lenient than what a judge would impose after a criminal conviction." He winced at the word criminal, but didn't argue the point. "Giving up my real estate license means surrendering the career I've built over 30 years. It means starting over at 53. Taking my college fund meant gambling with my future," I replied evenly. "Why should your career be protected when you were willing to sacrifice mine?" For once, he had no ready answer, no smooth justification. He stared at his hands, now fidgeting with his wedding ring, a nervous habit I'd never seen from him before. "I've signed the agreement," he said finally, sliding the folder toward me. "All of it, without amendments or conditions." Mr. Grayson took the folder, checking that all necessary pages had indeed been signed and properly witnessed. He nodded to me, confirming everything was in order. "May I ask why?" I said, genuinely curious about his decision. "You fought us at every step until now. What changed?" My father looked up, meeting my eyes directly for perhaps the first time since this ordeal began. "Your mother gave me an ultimatum. Either I accept full responsibility in these terms or our marriage is over." He attempted a smile that came out more like a grimace. "And Haley? She told me she couldn't trust me anymore unless I proved I was still the father who taught her about integrity and consequences." He looked down again, his voice dropping. "I've lost so much already, Tyler. My wife's trust, my daughter's respect. Your—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "My what?" I pressed. "Your belief in me," he finished quietly. "All those years you looked at me like I could do no wrong, like I had all the answers. I didn't realize how much that meant to me until it was gone." It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard from my father, an admission not just of wrongdoing, but of the genuine loss he felt at damaging our relationship. For the first time since discovering what he'd done, I felt a flicker of something beyond anger and betrayal. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first step toward understanding. "What happens now?" he asked, looking between me and Mr. Grayson. "Now you begin complying with the terms," Mr. Grayson explained, "starting with your resignation letter to your firm and the disclosure to the licensing board, both due within 7 days. The community service hours must commence within 30 days. The financial audits will be conducted quarterly." My father nodded, accepting each requirement without protest. As the meeting concluded, he stood to leave, then hesitated. "Tyler," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but someday, when you're ready, I hope we can talk, really talk." I didn't answer immediately, unwilling to make promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "Let's see how you do with these terms first," I finally said. "Actions matter more than words. Now." He accepted this with a nod and left, shoulders slumped, but seemingly unburdened of the weight of deception he'd carried for so long. As the door closed behind him, Mr. Grayson turned to me. "Are you all right?" "I think so," I said, somewhat surprised to realize it was true. This isn't how I imagined my senior year ending, but at least it's ending on my terms, not his. "What about Cornell?" he asked. "Will you still attend?" I nodded, feeling a sense of certainty I hadn't experienced in weeks. "Yes. My mother has already arranged for the deposit payment. I start in August." For the first time in this long ordeal, Mr. Grayson smiled. "Then perhaps something good has come from all this. You've not only secured your educational future, but learned valuable lessons about standing up for yourself and demanding accountability from those who wrong you, even when they're family." "Especially when they're family," I corrected, gathering my belongings, "because that's when it matters most." Moving day at Cornell arrived with perfect late summer weather, clear blue skies and a gentle breeze that rustled through the campus's mature elms. I stood in my assigned dorm room, watching my mother arrange and rearrange items on my desk while my grandfather carried in the last of my boxes. "I think that's everything," he announced, setting down a container labeled "Winter" clothes in my hastily scrawled handwriting. My mother stepped back from the desk, surveying her handiwork. "Are you sure you have enough supplies? We could stop at the campus bookstore again." "Mom," I said gently, "I have everything I need. More than enough." She nodded, blinking rapidly to hold back tears. The past few months had aged her. New lines around her eyes, strands of gray she'd stopped coloring, but she seemed stronger somehow, more decisive. After 2 weeks in the hotel, she'd moved back home with my father, but their relationship remained visibly strained, a work in progress, with an uncertain outcome. "I should probably go," she said, checking her watch. "Your father's waiting for my call. He wants to know you're settled in okay." My father hadn't come to Cornell, my choice, not his. Our relationship was thawing, but slowly. He'd complied, with all the terms of our agreement so far, resigning from his firm and surrendering his real estate license without protest. He'd begun therapy, started his community service hours at a financial literacy program, and maintained complete transparency about his finances under my grandfather's watchful eye. Small steps, but meaningful ones. "Tell him the room is great," I said. "Better than I expected." She nodded, gathering her purse. He wanted me to give you this, when you were ready." She handed me an envelope, my name written on the front in my father's distinctive handwriting. "I'll read it later," I promised, tucking it into my desk drawer. After a tearful goodbye with my mother and a firm handshake from my grandfather, I found myself alone in my dorm room for the first time. The silence felt strange after months of constant family drama and legal negotiations. I opened the window wider, letting in the sounds of campus life, distant laughter, music playing somewhere down the hall, the occasional shout as new students recognized friends from orientation. I unpacked methodically, arranging books on shelves and clothes in drawers, creating order in this new space that was entirely mine. Around dinner time, my roommate arrived, a lanky engineering student from Seattle named Marcus, who seemed equally nervous and excited about starting college. We made awkward small talk as he unpacked, then agreed to walk to the dining hall together. The campus buzzed with first-day energy, upperclassmen reuniting after summer break, freshmen traveling in packs for safety and comfort. In the dining halls controlled chaos. I felt both anonymous and included, just another new student starting a new chapter, my complicated family history invisible to those around me. After dinner, Marcus headed off to meet friends from his pre-orientation program, and I walked back to our dorm alone. The late summer twilight cast long shadows across the historic buildings, and I took a meandering route, trying to commit the campus layout to memory. Back in my room, I found myself drawn to the desk drawer where I'd placed my father's letter. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to start fresh without the weight of the past 3 months. But another part needed closure, or at least the next step in whatever our relationship would become. I opened the envelope and unfolded 3 pages of handwritten text. "Tyler, by the time you read this, you'll be at Cornell, beginning the future you've worked so hard to achieve. I want you to know how proud I am of you, not just for your academic accomplishments, but for the strength and integrity you've shown throughout this painful chapter of our family's story. There's no excuse for what I did. I've tried to understand it myself in therapy these past months, to unravel the psychology behind my actions. The truth is both simple and shameful. I convinced myself that the rules didn't apply to me, that my financial expertise justified risking your future for potentially greater returns, that my intentions mattered more than the deception required to execute them. I was wrong. Catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. When the investments began to lose value, I doubled down rather than admitting my mistake. When Amber's crisis provided an explanation for accessing the entire fund, I seized the opportunity, telling myself the story would obscure the truth until I could fix everything. Each lie required another to maintain, until I was hopelessly entangled in my own deception. None of this justifies what I did. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I haven't earned that yet. I'm simply trying to answer the question I saw in your eyes during our last meeting. How could your father do this to you? The answer is that I lost sight of what truly matters. I prioritized financial ambition over honesty, calculated risk over family trust. I forgot that my role as your father wasn't just to provide financially, but to model integrity and trustworthiness. Failed you. Completely and utterly. The terms you've required of me are fair, perhaps even merciful given the alternatives. Meeting them is the least I can do to begin making amends. I don't know if our relationship can ever fully heal, but I promise you this. I will spend the rest of my life working to become the father you deserve, whether or not you choose to give me that chance. For now, please know that I am deeply sorry for the pain I've caused you. I'm immensely proud of the man you've become. Perhaps even more so because you've become that man despite my failures rather than because of my guidance. I love you, Tyler. I always will. I set the letter down, a complex tangle of emotions rising in my chest. There was no easy forgiveness waiting to be unlocked by his words, no magical healing of the broken trust between us. But there was something. A small opening, perhaps, where genuine remorse had created space for the possibility of a different relationship someday. I tucked the letter into my desk organizer, neither rejecting it nor embracing it fully. Like so much about my family now, it would take time to process, to determine what place it would hold in my new life. My phone buzzed with a text from Haley. "How's the dorm? Any cute girls on your floor? Send pics." I smiled, snapping a few photos of my half of the room and sending them to her. Despite everything, Haley and I had grown closer over the summer. She'd watched our family implode, then begin the slow work of rebuilding, showing a resilience I hadn't fully appreciated before. Now she was starting her junior year of high school with a new perspective on family dynamics and financial security, her own college fund safely under our grandfather's trusteeship. As I was responding to her text, another message arrived from Aunt Melissa. "Amber got her 6-month chip today. She asked me to share this photo with you. She's doing really well in the program." The attached image showed Amber holding a sobriety medallion, her smile tentative but genuine, her eyes clear in a way I hadn't seen in years. I sent back congratulations, surprised by how happy I felt for her. Whatever resentment I'd initially harbored toward my cousin had dissipated as I came to understand how her crisis had been exploited by my father, both of us manipulated for his purposes. Amber and I had begun an occasional text exchange over the summer. Nothing extensive, just brief updates on her recovery and my college preparations. There was a fragile connection forming there, one that might develop into a real relationship over time. She'd even talked about visiting Cornell when she completed her program, a possibility I found myself open to considering. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. An RA stood in the hallway, clipboard in hand. "Tyler Wilson? There's a floor meeting in the common room in 5 minutes. Mandatory for all freshmen." I thanked her and grabbed my key, joining the stream of new students heading toward the lounge area at the end of the hall. The nervous energy was palpable. Everyone trying to make good first impressions, establish connections, find their place in this new community. As I took a seat on one of the couches, I felt a strange sense of disconnect from the person I'd been just 6 months ago. That Tyler had been naive in some ways, trusting without verification, believing in the inherent rightness of family authority. That Tyler couldn't have imagined standing up to his parents, demanding accountability, or navigating the complex, legal and emotional terrain I'd traversed since April. The RA began her welcome speech, outlining dorm rules and community expectations. I listened attentively, but part of my mind was still processing the journey that had brought me here. Not just to Cornell, but to this new version of myself. After the meeting, a group decided to explore campus together, and I joined them spontaneously. As we wandered the grounds, pointing out architectural details and speculating about which buildings housed which departments, I found myself engaging easily with these strangers who knew nothing of my family drama. Here, I wasn't the kid whose dad stole his college fund or the son who almost sent his father to jail. I was just Tyler, a freshman from Pennsylvania, interested in economics and the debate team. It felt liberating. Back in my room late that night, unable to sleep from a combination of excitement and unfamiliar surroundings, I opened my laptop and crafted an email I'd been contemplating for days. Mr. Grayson, I wanted to update you as I begin my first semester at Cornell. The tuition has been paid in full, and my mother has established a separate account for future educational expenses that only I can access. My father continues to comply with all terms of our agreement. Grandfather reports that he's been transparent in the financial audits and conscientious about his community service hours. The therapy seems to be helping him understand the patterns that led to his actions. I'm not sure what our relationship will look like going forward, but I'm open to a carefully rebuilt connection over time if his actions continue to demonstrate genuine change. More importantly, I wanted to thank you for your guidance throughout this difficult process. You helped me navigate a situation that could have destroyed my future and my family completely. Instead, because of your counsel, I was able to secure my educational opportunities while giving my father a path to redemption that doesn't involve criminal prosecution. I've learned invaluable lessons about standing up for myself, demanding accountability, and finding solutions that acknowledge harm without causing unnecessary destruction. These lessons will serve me well throughout my life, and I'm grateful to you for helping me discover them. With appreciation, Tyler Wilson. I hit send, then stood by the window, looking out at the campus quad. The historic buildings glowed softly, under strategically placed lighting, creating pools of warmth in the darkness. Students still moved about despite the late hour, their voices carrying faintly through the night air. This was what I had worked for, what I had fought to preserve. When my father threatened to take it away, not just the prestigious education, but the opportunity to define myself beyond my family's expectations and limitations. The chance to discover who Tyler Wilson might become when given space to grow into himself. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Just checking that you're settled in okay. Dad and I got home safely. Haley says hi." I responded with reassurance and a promise to call over the weekend, then set my phone aside. I had orientation activities starting early tomorrow, new people to meet, a campus to navigate, classes to prepare for. A knock sounded at my door. Marcus, returning from his evening out. "Hey," he said, dropping his key on his desk. "Some of us are heading to the late-night cafe for coffee. Want to join?" An invitation, a beginning, an opportunity. To step fully into this new chapter. "Sure," I said, grabbing my jacket. "Let me just find my ID card." As we walked across the darkened campus with 3 other freshmen from our floor, the conversation flowed easily from hometowns to intended majors to first impressions of Cornell. When someone asked about my family, I gave the simplest version. Parents. Still together in Pennsylvania, younger sister in high school. The complicated truth would emerge eventually, with friendships that deepened beyond surface connections. But for tonight, it was enough to be here, moving forward, carrying the lessons of the past without being defined by them. In the brightly lit cafe, surrounded by the energetic buzz of students beginning new adventures, I found myself smiling at a joke someone made about dining hall food. A genuine smile, unforced and unguarded. 6 months ago, my entire future had been derailed by my father's deception. 3 months ago, I'd been embroiled in legal negotiations and family conflict, uncertain if I'd make it to Cornell at all. Tonight, I was here, not unscathed, not unchanged, but present and moving forward. The journey had cost more than just money. It had stripped away illusions about family infallibility, tested relationships to their breaking points, and forced me to advocate for myself when those who should have protected me failed. But it had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed, allies I hadn't fully appreciated, and a resilience that would serve me well in the challenges ahead. As the night stretched into early morning, our small group of new friends making plans for weekend exploration of Ithaca's famous gorges, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: possibility. Not just the reopening of doors that had nearly closed, but the discovery of new pathways I hadn't previously considered. My college fund had been taken, then restored. My family had fractured, then begun the slow work of rebuilding on more honest foundations. My trust had been shattered, then cautiously extended to those who proved worthy of it, and I had emerged, not unbroken, but stronger in the broken places, ready to write my own story, on my own terms. When I finally returned to my dorm room as dawn was breaking, exhausted but exhilarated by new connections and possibilities, I noticed my father's letter still on my desk. I picked it up, reading the final lines again. "I'm immensely proud of the man you've become, perhaps even more so because you've become that man despite my failures rather than because of my guidance." There was truth in that. The person I'd become through this ordeal was shaped not just by what had been taken from me, but by how I'd responded to that taking, by the boundaries I'd established, the accountability I'd demanded, the careful balance I'd struck between justice and mercy. I placed the letter in my desk drawer, neither discarded nor prominently displayed. Like my relationship with my father, it occupied a liminal space now, waiting for time and actions to determine its ultimate significance in my life story. Tomorrow, technically later today, classes will begin. I'd take notes, participate in discussions, and begin building the academic foundation for whatever came next. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, my father would report for his community service hours, attend his therapy session, continue the work of becoming someone worthy of trust again. Parallel journeys of growth and redemption, connected but distinct. I set my alarm and climbed into bed, physically tired but mentally at peace in a way I hadn't been since discovering the emptied college fund months earlier. Whatever challenges lay ahead, academic, financial, relational, I would face them with clearer eyes and stronger boundaries. Some lessons come at devastating cost, but once learned, they become an indelible part of who you are, guiding your decisions, informing your relationships, shaping your understanding of what truly matters. My father had paid for my education twice, once with money and once by showing me exactly the kind of person I didn't want to become. Both were valuable in their way. Both would influence the path I chose from here. As sleep finally claimed me, one thought remained. This wasn't the beginning I had expected, but it was the beginning I had earned. And whatever came next would be on my terms, not anyone else's. That knowledge, more than any college fund, was the real treasure I'd fought to secure. And unlike money, it could never be taken away. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories, ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.